friend of a friend had a son whose name was Hadyn. Hadyn died at the age of 19. This was a young man who deserved a tribute. My chosen opening pitches happened to be the opening pitches of the Hadyn Symphony. My piece has become a kind of prelude to the 104th Hadyn Symphony. There are places where all of the first violins may be playing patterns based around the fifth, but they're playing them in harmonics. If you listen attentively, it goes on forever, like a kind of a kaleidoscope. I've tried to write something that is for the general audience of the orchestra, and I'm saying this is the contemporary sound world which I've written for you.
We're in the Harty Room in the Department of Music at Queen's University Belfast to meet composer and pianist Professor Simon Mawhinney and explore his new piece for the Ulster Orchestra. Simon, welcome. It's an intriguing title for the piece. Tell us about that and what inspired it.
The piece is called A Pillar of Light for Hadyn, and the story of this is a friend of a friend had a son whose name was Hadyn. He was an extremely gifted boy, a prodigy in some ways, in maths and had all the signs of having a glittering career. And he was suddenly diagnosed. He had a brain cancer, and Hadyn died at the age of 19. His father actually wrote a book about the experience, and I tried to read this book, but I gave up after about 5 pages. It was too harrowing. The story of this bright light that was extinguished so quickly was inspiring enough, but the connection of his being called Hadyn struck me as a musician.
Yeah, I was going to say, so did subconsciously or consciously then did it influence the initial creation of the materials and referencing?
For sure, it was almost in a flash. I had this feeling that this was a boy, a young man who deserved a tribute, and the coincidence or synchronicity of his name just couldn't escape me. I began thinking about a piece like this a few years back, actually. And when the opportunity came to write for the orchestra, it seemed the ideal point to do it. Then I expressed the hope with the orchestra that the piece might actually be paired with a Hadyn symphony. And at the time I was thinking of the early symphonies of Hadyn because one, they're useful, very obviously, and two, there is a lot of soloistic writing in the Hadyn early symphonies, more so than in the later symphonies. Almost peculiar soloistic writing, for instance, a double bass solo in the trio section of a minuet. And that chimes with my own practice in writing for orchestra. My thinking about the orchestra has always been about the opportunity to explore this ensemble as a collection of soloists. So it's almost a chamber conception of the orchestra, and the Hadyn early symphonies have that. So my initial thought had been that it would be connected with, paired perhaps with an early Hadyn symphony. But when the actual program was confirmed, it turned out to be the final symphony by Hadyn, 104th Symphony. And I didn't do this deliberately, actually. It was again a magical coincidence that my chosen opening pitches happened to be the opening pitches of the Hadyn Symphony.
Can you just let us hear that?
And that opening fifth on D&A is sustained for roughly 2 minutes in the Hadyn 104th Symphony. My piece opens with the same 2 notes, and it ends with the same 2 notes, and therefore it has become a kind of prelude to the 104th Symphony. And the 104th Symphony has got this mysterious opening, and then after that it becomes what my son calls Happy Haydn, so the D major. I think that this will be an interesting example of catharsis in music, because my piece is a contemporary piece. It reflects the era it's written in. It reflects all the music that's come in the past 100 years. So it will sound like a contemporary piece.
There's something about that interval of a pure fifth,
Yeah.
isn't there, that attracts composers to.
Yeah.
It's like they're setting up something from the beginning.
Yes.
Of like
Yes.
Beethoven 9,
Yes.
the beginning,
Yes.
or Mahler 1,
Yes.
the same thing, and it's the
Yeah.
same pitches again. There's something
Yeah.
about that sonority.
Yeah. I don't think those later examples are coincidences. I think that we know Beethoven was deeply immersed in Haydn's music. If you take the early piano sonatas of Beethoven and turn sonatas by Haydn at the same time, you can just see where he has almost stolen ideas. He was really immersed in it. And the fact that the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven starts in the same way with the same two pitches can't really be a coincidence. He was really into that kind of idea of musical intertextuality. And Mahler was enough of a Beethoven acolyte that he attempted to rescore the Ninth Symphony and improve its imperfections. And he begins his first symphony in the same way with the reliance on that. So there's a historical trajectory. And Bruckner can't have been ignorant to it when he tried to write his Ninth Symphony in D minor, which also evokes that sense of the cosmic with this particular pitch. So I find as a composer, I do tend to view certain sounds through the lineage of sonorities through time. There's a connection there. And it's not a mistake or an accident that I have gone with this D and A as a major part of my piece. But I think then, therefore, the 2-minute opening of the Haydn Symphony will be greatly extended up to 11 or 12 minutes through my piece, which is almost like a refraction. And a good way of thinking about it is looking at the Haydn through stained glass, but my stained glass isn't representational, it would be abstract.
Give us a sense of the sort of narrative arc of the piece. Did you have a narrative in mind, or was it purely musical materials that took their own course, as it were?
It's, for me, the narrative element in music is always very, very strong. It's not a representation of something as such. It's simply the story of what happens musically through the course of the piece. The narrative of a piece is there to guide the listeners through something. So if you imagine a garden with a path through it, like a manicured garden with a path through it, the narrative or the form of the piece is the path, and the purpose there is to guide you through so that you can experience the surroundings. So here, a pillar of light for Haydn. So I've explained why Haydn. The other aspect of this is a pillar of light. What's that about? That is a sort of extra musical thing. There is a kind of poetry or an image in that, and I'm really thinking of a kind of surreal vision of a heavenly garden with a kind of mysterious pillar of light suspended in it. So a heavenly
how
kind
do you
of
represent this sonically?
So yes, so when I'm thinking about light. And in this particular case, we're thinking about light in a almost, as I say, heavenly realm. So we're moving into territory that should take us beyond what is normal. So we take by extending things. So the fifth is the opening sound. When you first hear a fifth, it's a fifth. And you have to use your imagination to sort of feel its colours. A good example of a different sound would be if I take a semitone down here. That is a darker and a more tense sound. If I take a perfect fourth down there, that's a very different sound. So if we take the D and the, or even D and A, that doesn't bring about a feeling of illumination or light in the same way that we do when we get there. And that, to me, has a kind of brightness and clarity. I suppose it's interesting to say that I'm not immune to the kind of synesthetic aspect.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to make something of that, because it sounds like trying to pretend to be another composer that you're probably thinking of. And I don't think that it's at all unusual for people to feel a sense of colour and sound. I think people make far too much of Messiaen making claims that he could hear certain colours. I found children can easily do it.
There's the other thing in an orchestra, that if we can achieve perfect intonation of an open fifth, you begin to hear the third of the chord. Which is one of the tests for maybe building up a really well-tuned chord in an orchestra.
Yes.
So were you thinking of that, just that open fifth, then people will invest it with other things just unconsciously, but it begins to take on much more richness than you would think two simple pitches would do?
Yeah, because ultimately a sound is made up of many sounds, and if you think about the Pink Floyd album with the prism and the light going in and the rainbow coming out, all sounds are based that way. So for instance, if I take the D down there,
so there's the third very strongly.
So it's all built into the sound. I've got this interest in Western classical music, but I'm also a very keen listener to non-Western music as well, and I've had my fair share of listening to Indian music and Persian music, Arab music, and everybody knows that the drone is a fundamental aspect in Indian music as well, through the tanbura and so on. When that's played as a drone, kind of in that kind of territory, it develops that kind of hypnotic effect. And although a drone for me works best in the bass, but in this particular example, it's actually coming up high in the higher register. You can see that it becomes a spiral of thought, and we've talked only about the first chord so far, but...
can you give us a sense of some of the essential materials in the piece, maybe in certain chords or colours?
I didn't write the piece primarily directly into full score. Most composers will have a kind of a short score, which will then be orchestrated. And as I was writing this, I realized that it could potentially work well as a piano piece. So I've brought along a copy of a piano version of the same piece, and it all fits onto 4 pages. The orchestral piece will be about 12 minutes. This one is designed to be anywhere between 4 and 20 minutes, but it's the same piece. It's the same basic structure.
So you're allowing for a big element of improvisation?
Yeah,
right.
In the piano piece, but not in the orchestral piece.
Yeah.
And what we have is the perfect fifth. We then have a second chord that goes with that, which is that. And it's normally with it. And that's one of the pillars, that's a pillar. And actually, I just realized, and another place this is coming from is the 6th small piano piece by Schoenberg. His 6th piano piece, I think it's Opus 19, which starts with that. And I always thought of that chord in the Schoenberg as a pillar of light. That always struck me. And I'm hearing a warmth and a brightness in that chord. It does that. So it's a calm sort of sound. So mine is definitely in that family. And then I even do the D major. So I just do the. And the piece does feature quite a lot of almost meditation on these sonorities, which then sometimes subtly change.
And it seems to me it's critical how you would orchestrate that, because depending on the instrumental colour that you choose for certain pitches, things will be more or less in the foreground. So you can have this ever-changing perspective on the same harmony, and it becomes emotionally very varied.
Yeah. The orchestration of it then is using not a large orchestra. It's 2 double winds, 1 percussionist, not a massive section of strings, but it does give everybody their own part. So there are places where the strings play in unison. There are other places where it's divided into desks, and some of those desks will have 2 staves on each part. So you'll have all of the first violins maybe playing patterns based around the fifth, but they're playing them in harmonics at different speeds. So you're getting a very, on one level, if you don't listen attentively, it sounds like a fifth, but if you listen attentively, it goes on forever, like a kind of a kaleidoscope.
Sort of slightly shifting tones of a colour.
Yeah.
You mentioned Ravel is a huge influence in how you write for an orchestra, and also your interest in Oriental musics. So is this reflected in the way you write for the orchestra in terms of maybe more exotic timbre or lots of percussion?
I would say that in the course of the piece, there would be no explicit influence from any musical practice outside of Western classical music. And I think that it's very important to me that one doesn't try to emulate a musical practice, but on the other hand, one's listening can be enriched, and one's way of focusing can be transformed somewhat by hearing these different musical practices from around the world. For instance, in the conception of what is a melody, I have a long solo towards the end, which is on the flugelhorn. And there are some examples of flugelhorn solos in the repertoire. The one that comes up to mind is in Mahler's Third Symphony, which is a post-horn solo normally taken by the flugelhorn.
Yeah.
And there's a biographical reason for my interest in that, which is that my grandfather was a fine flugelhorn player. He played Carnival of Venice on the flugelhorn, and
the famous showpiece and brass bands.
Yeah, and so I'm in a way haunted by the flugelhorn. He died very suddenly while he was still performing that piece, so it was a backdrop to my growing up that suddenly stopped when I was 20, and I still have the flugelhorn in my house, and occasionally I will play bits on it. So I have a long flugelhorn solo towards the end, but it asks questions of what is a melody, and you would, for instance, there is an accompanying drone, again another drone, which is this one. And that is melody, but it's not melody as in a hymn. It's not a Christmas carol. It has irregular phrase lengths. It has shapes that are much harder to memorize, but it's a kind of approach to melody that wouldn't be unfamiliar in Persian classical music, for instance. I don't think this sounds like Persian music, but it's a result of me living in an era where all this types of music is available.
Yeah, yeah. To be really geeky, the flugelhorn solo, right? Would you like it to be played as the instrument would be in a brass band, say with vibrato, or presumably it'll be played by a trumpet player in the orchestra who would play it in a conventional classical way of playing the trumpet?
What I find absolutely fascinating about composition is the way you can look at a score, and I can really do this with the score of this piece, and almost every bar there's something you could say about where an idea has come from, and I find that endlessly fascinating. So there are 2 notes for the actual trumpet in the entire piece. In the last page or last couple of pages, just 2 notes. I think it's just those 2 going onto the drone, and it's a harmon mute. So it's a Dizzy Gillespie sound.
Okay.
That's where that came from.
Right.
So to go back to your question about the flugelhorn, I have a model in mind, and it doesn't come from either of those sources. It's actually a trumpeter. I'm not even sure you could call him a jazz trumpeter. He's often called a jazz trumpeter. John Hassel, he's called. I don't know if you know this trumpeter. And he plays in a way where his instrument does not sound like a trumpet at all. It's a completely transformed sound. And one of the reasons why I wrote it in the lower register is because in the lower register it's possible to bend the pitches. You'll be able to play a little bit flat and find little slides, and there's at one point I asked the instrument to go down by semitones, but I've specified an open valve, so it's just with the embouchure. So
there'll be all sets of colours there, but more like a natural instrument, maybe of Haydn's time.
But I do think of it as a kind of jazz sound.
So does this mean there'll be a discussion between you and the trumpet player before rehearsal?
Hope so.
Just to give him or her that context?
Yes, it would be useful to be able to talk
and in my experience in orchestras, there is often no opportunity for composers to do that because of economics and time pressures. New music often doesn't get the full amount of rehearsal time that it needs. But we've just heard today that we're going to have 2 performances. You've repeated now, one for a BBC New Music concert and then in the Ulster Orchestra's main season.
Yeah.
Both dates in January. So it does give you an opportunity even between the 2 performances to be able to keep evolving it a little bit.
And this solo is probably 2 minutes long. It's a big chunk of the piece, and it's the final set piece of the entire work before it goes back to the opening drone. So yes, to be able to work on that.
So that's a big, substantial orchestral solo, and I'm thinking back to what you said about your composing for orchestra often is chamber-like, which is great from all points of view, from making the material more accessible to the listener who's hearing it for the first time, and because it's often my experience that new music for, say, a full symphony orchestra is often very densely scored and becomes impenetrable without a huge amount of explanation. But it sounds to me like your piece, people even without any context will be able to have time to enjoy colour and melody and find their way in.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there are places where there are places of density in the piece, and there are actual moments of darkness as well. I have a point in the piece where there's a saturation of register, and then everybody goes downwards, all in their own speeds, and that will create the most chromatic and, dare I say, atonal sounding moment in the piece, and it eventually goes to the trombones and tuba and solo double basses getting lower and lower, down into a point of of darkness, actually. So although it's called a pillar of light, we do have a moment of density and darkness right in the middle, which helps to make the other light parts seem lighter.
In terms of the inspiration for the piece and the tragic death of Hadyn, is the piece an elegy or a celebration of his life, or nothing so simplistic?
Yes. I think the right word would be visionary. And I don't mean I'm producing something visionary, because that sounds like I have insight. I'm not making a claim to being visionary. It's a piece that I hope creates a feeling of what it is to be visionary. I suppose if you think about Debussy writing his musical impression of the sea, I'm thinking about trying to create an impression of the visionary and its potential in music.
And possibly, is it an advantage that you didn't know Hadyn personally, so you're not tempted to represent certain moments in his life or certain characteristics? It's simply that you were so moved by such a tragic loss of a potentially wonderful young
and that's
lad.
why it's called a pillar of light for Hadyn. So it's a kind of a gift, in a way. And I do think that its effect will be best experienced in relation to the subsequent Hadyn piece, because that will be the familiarity. I've written it for the general audience. It's not meant to be. I mean, I'm quite happy to write a piece for an obscure, difficult piece for an audience. For instance, in Germany, I sometimes go to Freiburg, and the Ensemble Recherche do a series there, and you can write difficult music, and there's an audience of 200 or 300 go every week, and are absolutely thrilled.
And they will get a lot of the abstruse stuff.
And they will come up to you and say, das war
Ausgezeichnet.
wunderbar Musik. And they love it. The general audience of the orchestra, they do go to new music concerts. So the orchestra does play new music, but the core repertoire of the orchestra is the standard common practice music, from Bach or Handel through to Mahler, Stravinsky. Even when they go to Bartók, you know that that's more challenging. So Miraculous Mandarin or something would be a more challenging piece to put on. And orchestras around the world, that is the core repertoire. So when they play more difficult music, they have to think about how to program that and what the audience is. And so rather than fighting, some composers just decide to fight against that and to take an aggressive stance. I've tried to write something that is for that audience, and I'm saying, this is the contemporary sound world, which I've written for you, and I think hopefully that will work.
And your concept for the performance is that we would perform the Hadyn Symphony straight after your piece. So you can see that and hear the juxtapositions and hear where some of the elements came from.
Yes, and that would be the ideal. And whether it's practical is another matter. But if it's possible to play the piece straight through as one cycle, then we've got, I think, the basis there for quite a moving experience.
It becomes a concept concert then, doesn't it?
Yes.
And not the kind of traditional, here's the new piece.
Yeah.
It gets its 12 minutes of glory and then goodbye. Sort of thing.
There's an element of what is anachronistic in pairing repertoire. And I find programming very interesting. And to what extent should a piece of that era sit with a piece from its own era? Or is this kind of cross-historical, it is cross-cultural, because if we could talk to Hadyn from his era now, we would find that his manners, behavior, expectations, and so on are really alien for us. So it's a cross-cultural association as well. And yet there is that very strong lineage. And quite often you can see that these figures even encountered one another. Haydn encountered Beethoven, Beethoven supposedly encountered Liszt, Liszt encountered Wagner, and so on. And there's an overlap quite often. There was a real tradition there.
And sadly, I think because of modern marketing and programming, the average listener isn't aware of that.
Yeah.
They think of each composer as a separate entity, and they did all their new novel things, and they were in their silo. But when you get a sense of there is this lineage and continuity, but the constant reworking of the same materials, your listening experience becomes so much richer. Can we hear a little more of the piece? Yep. So we've got a sense of the opening of it and some of the basic material, and then give us a sense of how it progresses then into the center of the music.
Okay, so my opening use of the drone will be considerably longer in this version than it is in the orchestral version, so we'll see how it goes.
So that's my first hearing of it, right?
Yeah.
And it completely draws me in because of this arc of stasis where you create a sense of anticipation and then it goes off somewhere, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected. Then there's activity. And also, if we got a student to analyze the basic essentials, they would find this set of chords that itself has its own arc and takes you along with it. So hopefully that was your intention. That's my first impression of it.
And that bit there at the that's flute. it's almost obviously going to be flute. And then I repeat it with on the full first violins. So you get that lush, almost sort of Mahler effect of the unison strings. And then after that, we'll start to go into different territory, which eventually takes us down into the depths. And then I think it gets more busy in the middle, but eventually we get down into... And that's where 2/3 of the way through, we get a very long drone on this, which is the start of the flugelhorn solo.
You see that when you began that excerpt there, that kind of rolling darkness, which is so effective on a piano. So how are you going to translate that into an orchestra so you get this? For me, it sounds ominous.
Yes. Yes.
And so will you recreate that in the lower sonorities of the orchestra?
So I've got 2 bassoons, horns which can go low, 3 trombones, a tuba. I've got low harp, which won't be that audible probably, solo cellos going down to the lowest register, and solo basses, 5 basses going down into the lowest register. So through a counterpoint and very quietly, diminuendo down to the lowest levels and notes falling away gradually. So they're mixed. Tam-tam, I think, might be used at that point as well. So with a bigger orchestra, I would do more. So Harrison Birtwistle uses low register of the piano in our stances really effectively for that. So if, for instance, the opportunity came to redo this piece for a bigger orchestra, I would use more instruments.
And include piano, possibly?
Piano and more percussion, yeah. The drone, that one, has a kind of dark sound, I think, but I become much more fixated on those 2 notes, which don't have the same darkness for me.
They can be dark or light. Debussy would do that interval.
So that's where that comes from. Right, that's where that comes from.
Yes.
Okay. So that's a nursery rhyme. And I found that second, having heard it through that lens, becomes a warm sound, not a dissonance, but a warm sound. And I actually, again, going back to the synesthesia, I kind of perceive oranges and brown sort of a bit of, it's a wholesome, warm sound. I can feel it here.
I mean, that's Debussy and Ravel to an extent, back to their Oriental influences, isn't it?
And Ligeti uses that 2 of those in one of the movements of his chamber concerto. When he does that, starts the movement with low flutes, I think, which is a beautiful, warm sound. So I now use this major second as my go-to consonance. In fact, I treat it as a consonance.
Yes.
So that becomes a drone on those 2 notes, which has this lovely warmth, and the flugelhorn solo arrives out of that.
Simon, thank you. It's wonderful. Give us a sense of how the music ends and what you were thinking of when you developed that material.
So the opening is like this, and then it brings in a little solo fragment, right? And then it adds that chord, and the final section starts with this chord, and then it has the same thing, and then it ends with the 5th. So it's perfectly symmetrical ending, and I don't really remember why. I don't often feel the need to have a perfectly symmetrical ending. It just felt appropriate in this piece that it was a circular piece.
Yeah.
So it's more of the pillar maybe it's a rounder pillar, but also then it means that the piece is essentially the start and the ending are the same. So it's got a sense of oneness about it and a sense of return. It has a feeling of this is one moment stretched out to 10 or 12 minutes, and it ends seamlessly to connect with the Hadyn Symphony that follows as well.
And is silence at the end an essential part of the piece? So it's not discretionary when the conductor puts his or her hands down, but are you thinking of a silence and that kind of unspoken resonance as part of it?
Yes, yes. If it were up to me, and it isn't up to me, but if it were up to me, you would have the piece and then basically turning the page without much happening. Now, of course, in an ideal world, the extra musicians wouldn't even leave the stage.
Yeah.
And you're just waiting, and it would be a matter of opening up, you know, and then you bring in the same two notes. So as seamlessly as possible would be the ideal, yes. And I think that would be, I hope, an effective seg between the two.
Indeed. Simon, thank you so much. The world premiere of A Pillar of Light for Hadyn is in the Ulster Hall on the 18th of January in a BBC New Music concert, and then you can hear it again in our main concert season on the 26th of January, again in the Ulster Hall. Simon Mawhinney, thank you so much.
Thank you.